My name is Jen Fleming, and I'm the Career Advisor for Education, Nonprofit, and Government here at DePaul in the Career Center. And so myself and Libby put on these types of programs, so we're excited to have you guys here. And so I'm going to hand it over to Libby. At the very end, we will be launching a poll, so if you can stick around just for 30 seconds to fill that out, it really helps us out. And then for those of you just joining us, Libby mentioned if you're able to have your webcam on, awesome. It's just helpful for guest speakers to be able to see who they're talking to. If you're not, totally understand and completely fine. And this will be recorded as a heads up.
Great. Thanks, Jen. So like she said, my name is Libby Woodard. I am the Assistant Director of Employer Engagement and Internships here at DePaul in the Career Center. So Jen and I work together to put on events for students and create opportunities for our students and alumni. So I'm going to introduce our guest speaker today, Allison Lopez. She brings almost 20 years of nonprofit leadership experience to her role. She is the Executive Director of the Julie and Grace Foundation here in Chicago. And she's had plenty of experience in different nonprofits, lots of experience in grant writing. So she is going to share her screen with us, and she'll be able to do walk through the presentation, and then we'll save questions for the end. Again, this is being recorded, so feel free to take notes if you like, and we will also send it to you guys afterwards. So you can take it away, Allison.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. Looking forward to talking with you all today. Yes, like Libby said, I'm the Executive Director of the Julie and Grace Foundation and have been writing and then in the last 5 years reviewing grants for 20 or so years. I think I wrote my first grant when I was 19 in college. So this is geared basically as like fundamentals, right? Like this is basic introduction to kind of grant writing and what I would look for. And we're actually going to look at some a sample grant from DePaul to the Julie and Grace Foundation. So we'll get a chance to look at some actual writing as well. And I'm going to shoot to end at like 12:45 with kind of the presentation part so we can have plenty of time for questions. I've never gone through these exact slides, so we'll see how the timing works out. Also want to just preference, and I'll share my screen in a second. I don't have childcare today, so if you see small people pop up, we're just going to roll with it. It's the Rona, and that's what we're doing these days. So apologies in advance if that occurs. I will do my best to minimize their appearances. And let me share my screen. We good? Yes, can we see the screen now? Perfection. I'm also trying out a new way of sharing screen where I can see multiple things at the same time, so hopefully it's working. Okay, so fundamentals of grant writing. There I am. I'm going to focus mostly on foundation grants, just because that's my background. Most of my grant writing has been with grants to foundations, and now running a foundation, read a bunch of grants to a foundation. But I would say a lot of what I will be saying will apply to like governmental grants or grants to corporations. Governmental grants are really, really, really specific. They usually have super specific questions and have very formulaic rubrics. I think foundations are much more relationship based. So that's like, to me, the main difference. And also, honestly, a lot of what I'm saying would apply to fundraising, period, as you'll see when I get into things. Okay, so I'm going to start with a couple of, how do I advance my slide? Why is it not working? 1 second. There we go. Okay, a couple of really basic slides. This is a little outdated. I just haven't pulled the new data recently, but usually this pie doesn't change dramatically year to year, just to kind of give you a sense of the landscape. You'll see foundations over here, 16%, pretty substantial part of the dollars getting donated into nonprofit world. Individuals is always the largest. Some of those individuals end up requiring grant proposals anyway, so a little bit of a mix. And then just another generic slide that our world is continuing to get more and more generous. If you want my honest opinion, it's also because the gap between haves and have-nots continues to increase, and we get more and more billionaires every year. So that means that giving increases, but it's not exactly for the best reason. There you get my political slant on things. And then this is kind of where the guiding for what I'm going to talk about today. This is actually, I think, designed more for individuals, but I think for me at least, and I would say this is true for almost everyone who thinks about fundraising, and particularly grants, it's all about individuals still. Yes, you have to write an amazing grant proposal, and that's what we'll talk about today, but there are individuals on all sides of it. It's not just this like piece of paper that goes into the abyss that a computer is evaluating. So I think it's really helpful to think about this cycle and that it's a lot of different pieces. So I'll walk through kind of each of them and how they apply to grants, kind of starting from identifying where do you apply to, qualifying, like figuring out, is it a good fit, cultivating the like submitting the grant proposal. I suggest that's a meeting. Solicitations, like the actual writing of the grant proposal. And then also, I think because it's really helpful to think about it as a circle, you're not done when the grant proposal is submitted. And that's honestly, sometimes I think for me at least, what kind of like makes and breaks some of the relationships is how much do I hear from organizations after we've sent the check out? Do we get reports back? Do we get communication? Like most people are looking for an actual authentic, relationship with the organization that the grant is being awarded to. So I think that's the like last part of the circle is the acknowledgement and stewardship. And then hopefully it starts all over again the next year, or maybe you get a multi-year grant and it starts again in 3 years or, something like that. So we'll go through each of the steps. Starting with identification and research, this is I think this is the fun part. This is like the people who nerd out on things like Google. You get to Google your heart out and find all kinds of, it's almost like the matchmaking part of it, right? Like you're looking for things that are going to be a good match. So here are kind of my suggestions. So, let's say you're looking for, you're going to write a grant for a nonprofit that you're working with. It's like a youth after school program. You're going to look, there's a lot of different databases, and I'll show you resources at the end for where you can find databases. If you're on a shoestring budget, which I would guess most of you, if you might be like interning someplace or starting an entry-level job, you may not have access to all the like fancy databases where you can search by keywords. So some of the suggestions I would say is to look at who's funding quote unquote competitors. If you're like a Boys and Girls Club in Waukegan, look at who's funding another youth program in Waukegan, or who's funding the Boys and Girls Club in Chicago. And a lot of that is public by just looking at websites of similar organizations. Foundations who fund one after-school program, for example, are probably going to be interested in 10 other after-school programs, because that's probably just something that they care about. Like for us, we do a lot of funding in the immigration space. And so if you looked at like immigration organizations providing immigration services in Chicago, you're going to see our name as a donor for a lot of them. And if I was a new, perhaps, organization in that space, I would look at some of those ones who have been established or who are bigger to see who's giving money to them already. That's a really simple way to just start to develop your pipeline. A couple other ones is talking to like the local association here in Chicago. It's called Forefront. I think it's on my resource page at the end, and I can send these slides to Libby and you can share them with everyone at the end. But you could also just Google Forefront and you'll see it's the association here in Chicago, here in Illinois, actually, for all nonprofits and all foundations. They have a library where you can get free access to some of their databases, some of the big databases that you pay money for. They also will help you do research to look for grants. So they're like a really good place to start. They have some really expert librarians there. There's also Philanthropy News Digest. Forget what it's coming out of, the Foundation Center, I want to say, which has a different name now. And you can sign up to be on their list to get RFPs, which are requests for proposals on various topics like education or health. You can also sign up for newsletters from some of the larger foundations to find out if they're ever like looking for specific things. So, like MacArthur or someone probably has newsletters that they're going to get out regularly. And it's good to just see sometimes. I know for us, we have a newsletter and we share, if we hear about other requests for proposals, we'll share them through our newsletter. So we try to be useful to our grantee partners. Anything that I missed? I think that's what I'd say about identification and research. Oh, and before I forget too, if you have questions, maybe put them in the chat and we'll try to do questions at the end. I think that's what we're shooting for. But if it comes up along the way, you can also put it in the chat and I'll do my best to see it. Or Libby or Jen, if you see something in the chat pop up, let me know. So I feel like with these windows, sometimes you can't see all of them and then I lose track of the chat and the presentation.
Yeah, if you guys have specific questions, maybe like quick ones to a specific slide, feel free to drop it in the chat and then I'll voice it. And then towards the end, we'll do more general questions if that sounds good.
Perfect. Okay, so then the next step, let's say you have these list of like 40 foundations or 10 foundations that you've pulled from either databases or you've looked at competitors and who is giving them money. Then what do you do with this list? You do not apply to all 40 of them. I'll tell you that right now, so that it's not a good usage of your time. What I would suggest then you take with that 40 is, or let's say 10, 40 is probably a lot, maybe focus on 10. I would look at each of their websites, see what they have published in terms of their guidelines. Like you look at our website and we're pretty clear on what our priorities are, but it's also really broad. But that at least will weed out if someone is saying they're interested in college access, it will do you no good to apply for them for a program that's about like preschoolers, right? If they're interested in focusing on the college population of young people, they're probably not going to be interested in a preschool program, for example. Education is my area where I have more experience, so that's probably the examples I'll use. You can also look at where they might have some geographic restrictions. Like we are mostly interested in Chicagoland. Most foundations tend to have some kind of geographic interest area. So again, like if someone, for us at least, is trying to get money for a program in Nevada, we're not going to be interested. It's just not a fit for where we're focusing our staff and ability to kind of know what's going on. And if they don't have information on their website, here's the other trick, which hopefully some of you know about, but this is like the best trick in the world. GuideStar, you can find anyone's 990. So, and it's free. You can go to guidestar.org, I think is what it is. And you just type in the name of the foundation, and I think you might have to create a username, but it's free. And then you pull their 990, which is their tax form. And you can literally says like 990, and then you can download. Usually it's a couple years outdated. So like right now you'd be able to pull the 2019, maybe 990. And on their tax forms, all foundations have to report who they've given money to and how much money they've given. So it's a really, really, really great like private investigator tool sort of to know what the dollar amounts their foundations are giving. Like it'll literally be 5 pages for, like for example, for us, it'll say like, $100,000 to DePaul University, $50,000 to Emoja Student Development Corporation, $50,000 to blah, blah, blah. So you can use that to kind of also see who are they giving money to, especially if they don't have a good website. Then the final step, which I highly, highly, highly recommend, is to reach out and try to get to a human. Unless it says in bold letters, do not make a phone call, follow directions, same thing you would do as applying for a job. But if it doesn't say that, highly, highly, highly recommend trying to get your foot in the door. The same way I would suggest if you're looking for jobs probably too. Try to connect with a human. Send an email, set up a phone call, like try to get a conversation with a human being, because a human being is going to give you a lot more of the nuances of what they're looking for and whether you might be a fit or not. And a lot of foundations are pretty open to having those conversations, unless, again, it clearly says don't call. But if it doesn't say that, I highly recommend trying to talk to someone, because the humans will give you the better insight of what they really care about and some tips. And websites, quite honestly, are not always fully up to date. And I know I try to have, like my staff, we generally will respond to anyone who usually submits like an email inquiry. We'll at least have a 30-minute phone call with anyone who's like mildly a fit, just to kind of see if there's further information we can give or further information we can get. I think a lot of foundations operate the same.
It looks like there's a question kind of related to that in the chat. It says, in your experience, will most foundations have an information interview for a nonprofit interested in a grant application?
Such a good question. Oh, thanks, Libby, for putting in GuideStar too. It's a mixed bag. I would say 50-50. I think it's always worth trying. And you're not going to get penalized for trying, is what I would say, in terms of being able to have an informational interview. And it is, I would say that's in general, that every foundation is different. Like what I'm saying is not going to apply to every single foundation you talk to. So I'm trying to think in terms of like majority in my experience. I think a good portion are willing to have those conversations. So it's definitely worth trying. Okay. My mouse is not being sensitive today. Okay, there we go. This is sort of the 2.0 version of what I was just saying, is just the cultivation part. This is really more for individual donors, but I think I would refer back to, there are individuals making these decisions. It's not a computer reading the proposal and like plugging in some algorithm. It's human beings making the decision. So as much as you can, remind them you're a human being on the opposite side, right? As the grant writer, or, maybe if you're at a nonprofit, it's someone else that's making those phone calls. I would definitely try to connect to human beings. And even if they say no, this is also my other like kind of a pushy tip, is if a foundation's like, no, I'm not interested, this isn't a great fit right now. The next question is this a no forever? Like what would make it a better fit, right? The kind of question of, what if this changed, or is it about geographic, to try to understand why it's not a fit. Oops, I went forward. I think that's the other key, is that we have had a few, in my example, in my foundation, we've had, I can think of at least a handful, where the first answer was, it's just not a fit. Like we didn't have room in the budget, let's say 1 year, but they stayed in our mind. And like last year, even, I think there's one that we brought in that took us like 3 years to actually have room in the budget. But because they've been in touch with us, and after that initial phone call, we're like, yeah, great work. We just don't have space in our budget. But that organization continued to, they put us on their email list. They invited us to things. They sent us like, oh, hey, we're doing this advocacy thing with, it was in immigration. So it was with like, kids who are in the immigration system. So they like kept in touch with us. And I think that's the part that's really key. Even if you get a no on the proposal, even if you get a no in the phone call, it's like staying in touch with them. It's kind of like the dating part of it, I guess. Very strange analogy. I would also, like, one other random tip I would say is, if it's not a fit with one funder, it's a good opportunity to ask them, who else do you know that we should be approaching? Who else do you know that we should add to our list? Because foundations talk to each other. And I can tell you, like, off the top of my head, if you just told me you had a program that was, interested in like health, I'd be able to tell you 3 other foundations that also fund in that space, even if it's maybe not a perfect fit for us. And people like to feel useful. So if you give them a way to feel useful, like, what other ideas do you have for me? Chances are you might get some tidbits out of that kind of conversation as well.
Quick question in the chat. This is kind of related, but do you know if these informational interviews are something they should do with government individuals as well? I know your experience is more education, but
yeah, I don't have as much experience with government grants. My understanding is they are one grant that I have done government type work, like a governmental big federal grant, is that they are much more formulaic, and they will have like a 50-page RFP that has very specific directions. And usually with those kinds of proposals, they will have like a time that they'll have like informational meetings that you'll attend, and they will try to restrict your ability to like connect with people individually, because I think honestly, because the government is trying to do the right thing, right? And they're trying to be unbiased in their decision making and make it much more formulaic. So it's coming from a good place. So with government funding, usually it's much harder to get any kind of individual connection going, and you just have to follow their rules, like to a T, follow their rules. Individuals, it's like the exact opposite. For sure, it's going to be decisions made with much more of a relationship lens. So I for sure think the like having meetings and having conversations with people applies when you're thinking about individual donors. Okay, so now we're getting to the actual grant writing. The actual writing the grant. So again, I say have a pre-application call. Even if they said you can apply, have another phone call, like just to go over kind of the pieces of it, if they'll let you. If you have specific questions, reach out to folks. we're going to go through kind of the pieces of a grant. This is more just my like general tips. When writing a grant, I think about grants as like persuasive essays, basically, with specific questions. So you're always writing with like this lens of persuasion and trying to make it a compelling case. One of my tips I would say is like to remember that it's not about necessarily the organization itself, it's about the mission of the organization. So like, who are you working with? What is the organization trying to do? It's not, we need a new building because our roof is falling off. It's, we need a new building because we are, providing temporary housing for hundreds of people and the roof is falling off, right? It's not like donors do not give just to have a new roof on a building. They're giving because they want people to have housing. So I think it's like always thinking about that end mission as the things that you want to be highlighting. I think the other things that we look for, and I think probably applies generally, is like the compelling reasons why someone needs the funding right now, why the organization needs the funding right now. Are they growing? Are they doing something new? Are they, do they have a long history of having incredible work that's really needed right now? Is it like for immigration right now, right? We got a new president. And so this is like really the time for immigration advocacy that needs to be happening. There's some incredible opportunity for immigration reform. Like that's a very compelling thing right now of like, yeah, you got to give us money because this is the time. We actually have an opportunity to get immigration reform passed, just as an example. And then I think the other things we look for, and I think pretty much applies, is like, is the plan logical? If it's for a program, like just doesn't make sense, right? Like, is it thought through, and are there experienced staff that are doing it? For us, especially, I think a lot more foundations now these days are looking for this, but I will just speak for us. We're really looking for organizations that are led by folks in the community. So if you're running an after-school program in, I don't know, let's say Little Village, we would be looking for the director of that program to be like from Little Village, or at least have deep experience in Little Village. We're not looking for, a woman from Wilmette who wants to help the poor kids from Little Village. We're looking for like the community of Little Village saying they want this after school program. Again, that does not apply to everyone, but that is definitely how we think about it. So I think like knowing your audience is helpful, and being able to make the point that like, we're the right ones to be doing this work. The organization, right? The other piece is SMART goals. You can Google SMART goals. It's really just kind of being logical and having measurable goals. And I'll give you some examples using the DePaul one in a few minutes. And then a clear budget and financials. And the budget, to me, I think it needs to tell like a story, right? If you're submitting for a program, I like to see a budget that like values the things that the program says it's valuing. If it's an after school program, let's say, the budget should have staff that are being paid fairly in the budget. You can't run a program without having staff, especially if you're thinking about like right after school program. So I would be looking for like all of those costs to be included in a budget, and not just, like $5,000 for supplies. Okay, who's going to be running those activities with the young people? Like, I want to see a full budget that has everything included. I see a few chat things. Is anything right now?
Yeah, one question. We'll save the other two about specific foundations for the end, just so we stay on track with what we're talking about right now.
Okay.
But Anna asks, can you talk about mission? It's so tricky in the arts. So many sound the same.
Oh, yes, that is tricky. I mean, I think from the grant writing side, it's about kind of literally, I think what you're saying, Anna, is how to make yourself stand out, and sort of what does make the organization unique. Because, what is it beyond the mission? Maybe the mission sounds super similar to another arts organization, but from what I've seen of organizations, there is something that makes that organization special. And so in the grant writing, it's like highlighting that. It's that, I don't know, maybe your plays are written by young people in the community, or maybe it's that you are giving like young musicians who are typically not the people who, have had access to musical training or something. It's whatever like makes the organization unique. To me, it's actually less about, I mean, I see 6 million missions a day and they all sound lovely. So it's like less about what the mission says and really more about the real speak, what makes them unique. I don't know if that's helpful, but that's what I would say. I know it's tricky. Okay, so we're gonna go through a little bit of just the components of a grant. Or this is kind of typical components. Again, every foundation is gonna have their own questions and components. I think most of them involve some kind of compilation of these things and then probably a whole bunch of extra stuff. So usually there's some kind of summary or an introduction piece, and that should be like well written and concise. I also will say this, again, depends if maybe like a PhD person is reading it. I like to read things that are written in plain English. If it's a lot of jargon, I get confused. Even if I know the jargon, I start to space out and reading it, right? Like usually the person that you're giving these grants to is reading like 30 or 40 grants in a cycle. Even for us, a small foundation, we're reading, probably each person's reading 20 grants a cycle. And so my eyes will start to glaze over if it's not just written in like plain English. So I, have like your grandma or your roommate or something read a grant before you submit it. And if they can understand it, then it's good to go. Because you never know how much the person who's reading it like knows about your field. Unless you're 100% sure they know everything about your field, in which case go for it, right? The like PhD level thesis. But if you don't know that, plain English. Usually there's a section about like the organization itself. Then the statement of need is like kind of when you start to get into the nitty gritty, like, why are you doing this? And who will it benefit? Why does the organization exist? Why does this project exist? And then a detailed description of what is the project or the program with, I like some sense of a timeline. Not everyone cares about the timeline, but I think it's really helpful. It like, helps it kind of come to life for me when I'm trying to understand if it's a program or a project, like, January or the first quarter is going to be this, and then the second quarter is going to be this, and then it's going to end with this. It helps me like kind of visualize it if it's something new. Evaluation of metrics is always really important to me. I like to know like, what is their end goal, right? Like, how will they know if they've been successful? And it's not always super clear. And I like when people are honest about that, right? Like if your long-term goal is, again, we'll continue with like an education program, right? Like maybe your after school program's goal is to help students improve their academics or get into college or just, like be happier human beings. And that's really hard to measure, especially if you're talking about just a one-year grant. But I want to see some kind of sense of like that you're looking at something and that the organization's being reflective at least. Maybe you're asking for like, survey or guidance from the young people that you're working with if it's after school program. And you're using that to improve the programming, I think is the piece that I would say for me at least is most important, that there is some sense of you're measuring something and you are using it to improve the work that you're doing, and acknowledging that most of the goals for these organizations are long-term. Like immigration reform, you cannot guarantee that that's going to get passed. But what you might be measuring is like, I don't know, numbers of meetings with legislators, or the amount of community members you're getting to show up for a rally, or, things like that, that are measuring like your ability to move towards the goal. Budget, I think I talked about, is just telling the like clear story. We're going to go through a DePaul example minus the budget because I did not get permission to share share the details of an actual request for DePaul with all the financials. And then some kind of conclusion, usually it's like your wrap up kind of last chance to make your pitch in there. And then a bunch of other, usually there's like optional places to put extra things. The extra things that I would suggest are if you have like a letter of support. Actually, I don't even really read the letters, but I more look at them as like, who signed it, right? Like, did the mayor of Waukegan say this after school program was great? Because that's a good sign that they at least have decent relationships with city officials. Or a story of people helped. I always like to hear about the actual individuals. Were there, like if with immigration reform or something, like who is the story of an actual human being that you're trying to improve their life by changing the immigration system. Or annual reports for an organization would be the other kind of thing you might include there. And then we will go through. So here's an example of an executive summary from DePaul. Like I said, this is from the Liberal Arts and Sciences College. This was an application to us 2018, I want to say, for a program that was about community engagement in LAS, with both internships for students to support both internships for students and then cross-discipline teaching. And so this is their executive summary. Executive summaries are, I love bullet points, highly love bullet points. Again, refer back to like someone's probably reading 20 applications, you know, in maybe like a week period. So it's really helpful to have something that people can read easily. So I like bullets for sure. Anytime you can give me bullets, if it's a list, it's going to make me happier. I think the nice thing about, I'm not going to read the executive summary. I'll send this out and you can read it yourself. It feels like an awkward thing to just listen to me read you 3 paragraphs. But what I think was helpful about this is kind of stating like, where is LAS at right now? Like they're already doing this work, right? Like that's helpful to know. Like this isn't coming out of nowhere. This isn't some kind of random idea that like, you know, Dean Guillermo cooked up in a room by himself. This is something that LAS is already doing. And this is like building on who they are and what they want to do. And it fits into their overall plan. And then I think the bullets were really helpful, that it's like, what is it about for students? Because we care about, if we're, especially with like DePaul, we care about the students. So what is the benefit to students? And hearing kind of these like concrete, like the awareness of issues, they're going to gain practical experience. That sounds awesome, right? And then just kind of the last sentence, like summarizing, what are they trying to do with this thing, right? Like you want to just keep reminding people exactly what it is that you're asking for in the executive summary. So I feel like this is a really good one to just clearly say what it is. And then here's DePaul's organizational background. I used DePaul because I figured you guys like obviously know DePaul. And so this is like, you know, this I think is typical of what you would see in an organizational background, something that's about how the organization's history, like a brief, you know, kind of put it in a paragraph, kind of why was it founded, like who was it founded by, what was the purpose of it. It's always really interesting because I think that like foundation story tells a lot about who an organization is. And if it doesn't tell a lot about who an organization is, it's a good point to be like, and then we changed, right? Like if maybe you were founded on something not great and you want to explain that, this is your chance to kind of explain that something changed. And, you know, maybe you were informed by your foundation and now it's totally different. But I think the really great things about the DePaul description is like it ties into who DePaul is and also like what we might care about, right? That was like, it's sought to serve Chicago's immigrant and working class communities. Like they know us, they know that we really care about immigration. And so I'm sure this isn't all of DePaul's descriptions, but like things like that make me feel like, oh yeah, like this organization's like one that we care about too. Like they have a similar mission to what we care about. And then like kind of the brief description, the second paragraph is really helpful. It's actually very impressive to me that DePaul can describe itself kind of in one paragraph. I think this is always the tricky part is, can you, when you're writing for an organization, can the organization describe itself in a paragraph? And I think that's the challenge for the grant writer, like you as the grant writer, is to try to figure out how you describe it kind of in a fairly short period of time. And I like this description. It gives you a sense of like, who is DePaul serving, the breadth of DePaul, and kind of the types of things that the various centers at DePaul care about. So I think this is like awesome, especially for a huge institution like DePaul to be able to describe it in a paragraph is challenging. The chat is blinking at me. Oh, I'll answer this one too. From Annabelle, do you recommend keeping grants typically within a certain number of pages? I recommend you follow the directions that you are told, because every foundation has very specific directions, unfortunately, for the most part. It's very annoying as a grant writer. I will tell you that right now, that you have to follow like character limits, and a lot of them are online right now. I could make something up. I would venture a guess that somewhere between 50 to maybe 75% of, for foundations at least, that grant applications are now done in online systems. And I know for our online system, I think almost all of them are like this. You set character limits. You can set character limits. Not everyone does. And so you should just follow the character limits. If they have no character limits, I could give you a recommendation, but I'm not sure I would stand by it. I would say like a letter of intent, an initial letter, should be not more than 2 pages, because someone's just skimming those pretty quickly. If you're doing a more meaty, like the full proposal, the narrative part of it, I would say generally super generic. Don't say this is like the Bible, but like 4 or 5 pages max. Trying to answer, the organizational background, the program description, timeline, metrics, 4 or 5 pages, generically for most foundations. If you're doing like a science research proposal, it's very, very different. It's going to be like 50 pages, it's very different. But I'd say if you're just generically kind of thinking about the length, that's my guess, but follow directions. Okay. Oh, need statement. This is where I was unable to copy everything, because this is where the narrative starts to get really long. But I did copy at least a little bit of kind of the need statement from the same DePaul application, because I think there's some really good things to highlight here. I think one, sorry, my child is here, 1 second. So one, I think if you're applying for something that already, I can't do this right now. If you're applying for something, for a program or a project that maybe already exists, to kind of explain what's maybe a little different about this year, or what you're extending. Like for DePaul, right, they were asking for support of internship programming. And in case me or the board member that might be reading it are confused, like, wait, you guys already have internships. What are we paying for again? I think it's really clear to have this need statement of like, yeah, we've had internships, but a bunch of students can't take advantage of unpaid internships. And if you want folks to have experience in like nonprofit community organizations, a lot of them can't pay for internships. So like explaining very clearly why this is important is super helpful, because it makes it very obvious when we're reading it, like, oh yeah, that's true. And we want students to be able to have internships, especially in community organizations. And we definitely want the students who are taking advantage of those internships to be, BIPOC students who maybe are first-gen students who have not traditionally had access to those kinds of like unpaid internships. So that I love that first paragraph with that. And then, so they kind of broke it into the 2 areas of the programming, right? Like there's a paragraph about the needs for the internship, and there's a paragraph about the needs for the other piece of the programming, which was around co-teaching and the professional development side for professors. And this one is also really strong. It's also explaining like, this is an expansion of what we're already doing. Like we have tried it, but this is like making it, it's bringing 2 different areas together, and it's explaining like, here's why it's been challenging, because there isn't a mechanism for having professors like co-teach classes and still get compensated appropriately. Like, it's about trying to work within the system that DePaul has. So I think that also makes a ton of sense to me to have this explanation of like, why are we trying to do this right now? And what have been the hurdles, and how is this proposal, going to help us escape those hurdles? Welcome to real life these days. I always think about those moments when you have seen like on the news or something, like literally like someone on TV and you see like their kid pop up, or like a dog run in. So fascinating to see those in like really public settings. So my mini experience of that. Okay, and then here are the sample, the metrics and goals that DePaul gave. So I skipped over, this was the part that was really long. The part that I did not provide because I could not even get it close to fitting on a slide was like 2 pages of the description of what they were actually going to do. And it was about 2 pages, like when I looked at the PDF in this like kind of tiny font. So maybe it'd be like 3 pages if you look maybe regular. And it was laying out kind of what the internships were going to look like, how were students going to find out about them, and how they were going to train professors and what kinds of classes they would do, how many classes, like the details and a timeline. So that's the part I did not include. Use your imagination. And these are the goals that they had, which I think is really, these are well-written goals. Of course, because DePaul has like a giant development department and really strong grant writers. But I think some of the things to note here is like, can you imagine measuring these goals? Like, do these have measurements built in? And they do. I think almost entirely. I mean, these are written in a very like, these are really good examples, I think, to look at, because they're written in a very like formulaic way that's like blah, will, blah, some kind of like verb, right? Like your thing will, whatever the verb is, whatever you're going to do, and then as measured by blah, however you're measuring it. I think when in doubt, that formula is the exact way to like think about goals. And even if you don't use that exact language, is like, is my goal saying that? Is it saying what I'm trying to do and how I will know if I did it? So, like, will improve students' career readiness. I mean, I could read, if you had it without the as measured, I'd be like, that sounds great. How on God's name will you know that you measured students' career readiness? Like, that's a very amorphous goal. So it's really helpful for them to say, like, we're going to do pre and post surveys, or I don't know, maybe there's other ways to do it, but it's helpful to know however an organization's thinking about the measurement. It is really nice to have that in the goals, because otherwise goals are just kind of living in the air unless you have a way of knowing what you'll be looking at. Oh, we are coming up on time. I think I'm near the end though. Okay, so yeah, so we're coming on the end of our cycle. So let's say you got the grant. Yay, congratulations. It's not over. The couple of things I would say is just you make sure you thank whoever you got it, whoever you got it from. And foundations, actually, we have to have these records for the IRS if we get audited. So we definitely need some kind of acknowledgement that has the like tax deductible part in it. And also it's just a good connection point to kind of, say thanks, reconnect with humans. And then after the grant is received, there's also usually some kind of report that's required. And if there isn't, it's also just nice to give some kind of generic update, like 6 months later, a year later, a touch point to just say, hey, like, here's what we did. Thanks again for the support. Also, if something's going to change, we like to know, right? Like, we like to have an actual authentic relationship with people. If your key staff member changed, if you're not going to achieve the goals, but it's because like last year, oh my gosh, the world got turned upside down, right? Like, and we just wanted to hear from folks what was going on. And almost like across the board, we were just like, yeah, whatever. You don't have, we're not holding you to any of your goals you set out, just tell us what you are doing instead. So I think just communication is just kind of the key. And then it takes time, but I do think it's really nice to keep in touch if possible, kind of any kind of updates, news, events, that kind of thing. Most foundations have staff or board members who like to attend things, but we can't attend if we don't know about them. So that's what I would say. Examples of the reports and inquiries. I could. Yes, I don't have them at the tip of my fingers, but basically for reports, it's essentially, for at least for us, and I would say for most people, it's reporting back against the goals that you stated. So like those lovely goals that were about, like students increasing their college readiness or career readiness, I'm sorry. The report would just be literally like the 5 goals and then, like a couple sentences of whether you achieved it or not, or like, there's always reasons. We just did an analysis last year, and I think like half of our grants only achieve some of their goals. And that's kind of what I would be looking for, because you want goals to be realistic. If the goals are always achieved, they're probably not super ambitious goals. If like 100% of the time you're achieving all of your goals. So that's what we look for in our report. I think that's fairly standard based on my grant writing experience. You just report against the goals that you set out. they're pretty simple. The reports are like 2 pages long for the most part at max, as compared to like the grant proposal. And then here's a bunch of resources. I will let you guys kind of peruse these on your own because we're nearing time. I want to give time for questions. The only one I would highlight that I like love these days is community-centric fundraising. It's a newer one. It's not just about grant writing. It's written, or it was started by Vu. I'm forgetting Vu's last name, but he also runs just a general nonprofit blog called Nonprofit AF. Yep, stands for what you think it stands for. And he started this community-centric fundraising with another person to kind of rethink how we think about fundraising. It used to be all the rage to be donor-centric fundraising, which is, as you might imagine, centering the donor in your fundraising, like, you know, making sure you're helping them understand that their donations are making a difference. And this is flipping that a little bit on its head. So there's a lot of great pieces there about like, should it really be donor-centric? Should it be community-centric? Like, what are we trying to do in the world? So love that one. And the rest of these are more kind of resources for finding out more information. Grant Space is a great one if you guys just want more information about grant writing. They have tons of webinars, like written pieces about how to write grants, examples of grants, like tons and tons of examples. I started to pull those examples and I was like, wait, why don't I just use one that I already have? Because I read grants every day. And then I had a couple of just like random career steps, knowing that a bunch of you are likely students from what I understand, maybe some alum mixed in. Practice writing anytime you can, write. It's like number one, because I think that's the piece that does seem to matter across the board, is having like well-written proposals. And then some other ideas like offer to volunteer as a grant writer for an organization you care about. Or most organizations would be super happy to have someone volunteer to investigate some grant opportunities or draft a grant, you know, for them, especially smaller organizations. And start with one you care about, because it's going to be a lot easier to write about something that you actually care about. DePaul also has some mini grants for students. There's, when I send this out, this is a hyperlink to, I think out of LAS, because that's the college that I know at DePaul the best. They have an undergraduate research grant that you can apply for. So like applying for things like that is really good practice. Of course, you should probably want them. I wouldn't say them just to practice, but also it's good practice, right? Like grants are grants. So the kind of the more chances you can write something like that, the better. Internships with nonprofits. Also highlight again, LAS has this internship program that we have funded so that you can actually get paid by DePaul to work at nonprofits. So take a look at that. I can send it, or Libby or Jen can maybe include that in some of the resources. I can make sure you guys have that link. Just plug for something we're supporting at DePaul. And then also just informational interviews with people working in the space. Like, you know, reach out to people who are, again, it may be organizations you care about, to talk to the folks that might have those jobs. Their jobs are they're usually called, sometimes they would literally be called a grant writer. Sometimes they're going to be called someone that's involved in corporate and foundation fundraising, like director of corporate and foundation fundraising, or corporate or institutional giving. Sometimes it's called that because it's like the institutions, and it's the institutions that usually require grants. And then of course apply for jobs. That's my other random one. And we have questions. I'm only 5 minutes over. I'm shooting to be done at 12:45.
Yeah, that was perfect. Thank you, Allison. Really quick, we did have a few questions in the chat earlier that were a little bit more specific to areas of foundations that students are looking at. I would probably recommend that you guys, you know, use everything that she just taught and look into those on your own, and looking into those resources that she'll send out or will send out with it. But do we have any other questions for Allison? We have about 5-ish minutes for questions. And if you want to raise your hand or just put it in the chat. I'm
going to stop sharing right now.
Open it up. Perfect.
And yes, the one, I do see the questions that are all about kind of, or the like 3 or 4 questions that are about finding a foundation that's interested in X. And I am probably not the best person to answer all of those questions. I would suggest going to some of the resources. But I will, if I think of anything, I'll include it for Libby and Jen to send out.
Perfect, thank you. Looks like Rich had a question. You want to unmute yourself? You can go ahead.
Hello, everyone. My question is, what approach would you suggest using if you are trying to actually start a nonprofit and you're seeking funding?
That is a great one. Depends. So depends on where you're at in the process of starting a nonprofit. Like, do you already have the 501c3 status? Because that's the piece that you're going to need to get any grants. Generally, almost with the exception, there's a few foundations that I can think of that do more like fellowships that will fund like you to start the nonprofit, right? That will give you as an individual a grant to kind of get a foundation off the ground. Otherwise, you need to have at minimum the 501c3 status. So like have gone to the IRS and gotten that declaration from them that you qualify as a nonprofit. And then it would be looking at foundations that are more open to new organizations. And usually it's going to be more focused on like the interest area that you're starting the nonprofit on. Like we actually do fund a decent number of new-ish, like fairly new nonprofits if they're in the area that we care about. We just funded last cycle an organization that was like brand new. They have no staff. They're started by an amazing teacher on the south side of Chicago, and she is doing this on the side. And when we gave her like $25,000 grant to try to get it to become a little more substantial, because she had an incredible vision with like very clear goals and was accomplishing a ton doing it as a side project. So kind of looking for someone, I would say a lot of foundations, if they were funding something new, would be looking for that. Like, have you been able to get something going as a side project? And like, if so, then that probably you're going to have a ton of passion there at least. And then off the top of my head, there's, give me a second to think of it, Rich, but there's like 2 organizations that fund startups, that like fund nonprofits getting going. One of them is Everest, I want to say.
I'm sorry, what is it again?
Maybe I'll include it to Libby and Jen's resources, because there are 2 that specifically that I've sent to other people that will fund like a 1 or 2 year, like $50,000 to $60,000, just like try to get your idea off the ground, see what happens, kind of a grant.
Okay.
And those would be good places to start too, because those are the kinds of foundations. You'll also be a part of like then a network, right, of other folks trying to get nonprofits off the ground.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I was wondering, how many grants do you advise applying for at the same time? You obviously using the same material.
Yep. Good question. As many as you have capacity for. No, I mean, kind of, yes, like kind of as much as you have the ability to be able to do. I mean, you're kind of limited by like the person who's writing them. The tricky part, especially if you're applying for the exact same purpose, right, is like, let's say you get one and then you've already applied for like 4 more for like a similar purpose. So there is a little bit of a juggling act. I don't think there's any harm in applying for grants for the same purpose. It's just on the flip side, you want to be honest. If you end up getting all of them, you would want to go back to them and say, we actually, are able to make our program bigger this year or something, right? Like you would want to explain and be truthful with organizations if you got, let's say, 2 grants for a similar purpose, that maybe you're able to do more than, and just be honest with them. So yeah.
Thank you. That's a very optimistic viewpoint.
I like to live in the optimistic world.
Thank you.
It looks like we have a couple questions, just kind of general advice in starting out and working in this field. Anything you would like to tell yourself when you first started out? Or
such a good question. For a nonprofit managing college interns who are writing grants. Well, here I would say, I think especially for that person, Annabelle, who you're talking about, you're managing other people who are writing grants, right? And this might be helpful for anyone who might be like managing like volunteers or something. But in general, I have always done this. It's really helpful to have like a template and keep track of like the wording that you use for questions. because every foundation will have slightly different questions, but you can probably reuse a good chunk of what you used from like a previous foundation. So especially if you're managing interns who are writing grants, it would be helpful to have them all like have some kind of shared document or something where they're keeping track of that template information, or you as a program coordinator or someone takes the first stab at writing like the initial template response, and then they can like modify it for different grants. There is absolutely no sense in rewriting something 25 times. That was something I learned very early on. Like, do not just open up a new grant application and just start writing, right? Like, take the previous one you wrote like 3 weeks ago, a year ago, and update the language or modify the language. And it also helps you maintain your sanity as someone who will likely be writing multiple grants, or like in your case, managing interns maybe who are writing a bunch of grants. It helps you be consistent if everyone is using similar language and then they're like modifying, right, something.
Great, thank you so much. So we are right on time, so we'll stop here. Give you a round of applause. Thank you so much, Allison, for coming.
Thank you all
The chat
for
is
taking time
very,
today.
yeah, excited. Sounds like it was really helpful. So thank you again for coming. I'm going to go ahead and launch the poll in a moment for the students. If you don't mind just taking that, it's just a quick 3-question poll, if you could take that. And then as a reminder, I will send out the recording of this video, the resources and the PowerPoint that Allison created for us. I'll send that out in an email either later today or sometime tomorrow. So just keep an eye out from that. No need to reach out. I'll send it to everyone that registered and everyone that registered in Handshake and in the Zoom. So we should be all set. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you all.
And
Have a good
Allison,
day.
I just wanted to confirm really quick. You're talking about the community-based project learning scholarship at DePaul, correct?
Yes.
Okay, I meet with lots of LAS students, and that is something that I probably share on a daily basis.
Oh, good,
just
good,
as a
good,
career
good.
advisor. I had no idea that you guys were the ones who had been funding it. I had wondered, to be honest. And as soon as you kind of started to show the grant, I was like, I wonder if this is for that. And
Yeah.
then I made that connection pretty quick, just based on what you shared. So I can say just, definitely the relief that I see in students' faces when I say, if you find something that is amazing and unpaid, there is opportunities to apply and get funding for it. So definitely something that is super appreciated by the DePaul community as a whole.
Awesome. That's great to hear. And yes, I thought it was fun to use a proposal that actually like connected to you all's work.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you again, Allison, for being with us today, especially despite having childcare, because I know how that goes. And I have to say kudos to your kids because it went very seamless.
They are used to being ignored. Well, thank you all again.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to go ahead and end the
Take
poll
care.
and end the meeting. So thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Allison.
Bye.